Fame is like the ocean. DiCaprio once admitted in a 2000 interview, "It looks beautiful from afar, but once you're in it, you realize how dangerous the waves really are."
It's the late hours in Cannes, May 2013. Flashbulbs fire like relentless lightning as Leonardo DiCaprio steps onto the red carpet for The Great Gatsby. He wears the tuxedo like armor, his smile rehearsed but radiant. The crowd screams his name, journalists jostle for a quote, and cameras drink in every gesture. To the world, this is the very image of triumph. Hollywood's golden boy, still at the peak of his power after 2 decades in the spotlight. But look closer. Behind that polished smile is a man who has, for years, lived under the crushing weight of fame. Whispers follow him wherever he goes, about his never-ending carousel of models, about his refusal to marry, about the private parties hidden from the public eye. Some tabloids paint him as a playboy who squandered his youth, others as an obsessive perfectionist, haunted by a fear that his greatest work still lies ahead and may never come. For decades, Leonardo DiCaprio has embodied the contradictions of Hollywood. He's the actor who can disappear into a role so completely that audiences forget his face. Yet, he's also the superstar who can't walk down a street without a mob forming. He's a philanthropist who has given millions to fight climate change, but also a man accused of hypocrisy for traveling by private jet. He's the Oscar-winning symbol of artistic dedication, but also the lonely figure often photographed, glass in hand, on a yacht at sunrise, surrounded by strangers, yet profoundly alone. The public knows fragments of this story. They've seen the blockbusters, the award speeches, the magazine spreads. They've laughed at the memes of Leo and his girlfriends under 25. But what they haven't seen, what lies beneath the laughter, the luxury, and the legacy, is a much darker truth. The truth that Leonardo DiCaprio, one of the most admired actors of his generation, carries scars far deeper than his characters ever revealed. Those scars trace back to a childhood spent in poverty, where broken bottles littered the sidewalks of his Los Angeles neighborhood. They deepened as he clawed his way up the industry ladder, battling rejection, typecasting, and relentless self-doubt. And they widened when fame arrived like a tidal wave, sweeping away his privacy, his relationships, and at times even his sense of self. There were the breakdowns hidden behind closed doors, the roles he lost because of his reputation, the projects abandoned after years of investment. There were betrayals from those closest to him, and haunting realizations that the industry he had sacrificed everything for was not built to nurture, but to consume. What the world saw as his greatest years, the Oscars, the billion-dollar box office, the environmental crusades, were also the years when Leonardo DiCaprio privately wrestled with loneliness, addiction rumors, and the fear that every smile he offered was nothing more than a mask. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all, in a career built on storytelling, DiCaprio's own story has rarely been told truthfully. Tonight, we go behind that story, behind the smile, behind the fame, behind the carefully crafted image of Hollywood's most enigmatic star, because the truth behind it is much darker.
Before he was Hollywood's brightest star, Leonardo Wilhelm DiCaprio was just a boy growing up in a broken neighborhood that seemed to mock his dreams. Born in Los Angeles on November 11, 1974, he entered the world at a crossroads of chaos and creativity. His parents, George DiCaprio, an underground comic book distributor, and Ermelyn, a German-born legal secretary, separated when he was just a toddler. Yet rather than shielding him from the instability, the divorce planted Leonardo firmly in the middle of 2 very different worlds. On weekdays, he lived with his mother in a tiny apartment near Hollywood Boulevard, a place surrounded by crime, drugs, and prostitution. He once recalled seeing heroin needles scattered on the sidewalk and listening to police sirens echo through the night. Poverty wasn't just an abstract condition, it was a constant hum in his daily life. His mother struggled to pay rent, and young Leonardo wore hand-me-down clothes that marked him as different at school. But there was also love, his mother's fierce determination to give him a future. She took him to free acting auditions, to museums, to libraries, insisting that creativity could be his escape. She drove me to every audition, every class, DiCaprio later admitted. Without her, I wouldn't be here. His father's influence was equally important, though less conventional. George introduced him to the world of underground comics, counterculture art, and radical politics. From him, Leonardo absorbed the idea that storytelling could be provocative, even rebellious. But George's bohemian lifestyle also exposed his son to instability. Parties, free spirits, and the absence of routine left Leonardo craving a sense of structure he rarely found at home. From the beginning, the boy stood out. His teachers noticed his boundless energy and mischievous charm, but also his restlessness. He struggled in school, easily distracted, always itching to perform. He was the class clown, the one who would break into impressions of teachers, exaggerate accents, and transform the mundane into theater. Acting, even then, was less a choice than a necessity, a way to make sense of the world around him.
But behind the humor, Leonardo carried wounds. He was mocked by classmates for his unusual name and for his poor background in a city obsessed with wealth and image. He never forgot the sting of being treated as an outsider. Those early humiliations planted a seed, a desperate hunger to prove himself, to rise above the noise and claim a place in the world. The auditions began when he was barely a teenager. Commercials, small TV roles, anything that might help pay the bills. But rejection came swiftly and brutally. Casting directors told him he looked too ethnic, not polished enough for Hollywood's cookie-cutter standards. At one point, his agent suggested he change his name to something more American-sounding, like Lenny Williams. He refused. The name DiCaprio, tied to his Italian ancestry, was the only inheritance he felt he truly owned. Still, the rejections piled up. He watched friends get roles he dreamed of, while he and his mother waited for buses home, pockets nearly empty. There were moments when quitting seemed inevitable, when the cruel machinery of Hollywood threatened to break him before he even began. But every no only fueled his resolve. And then came the breakthrough. At age 14, he landed a recurring role on the sitcom Growing Pains. It wasn't glamorous. The show was already fading in popularity. But for Leonardo, it was oxygen. It was proof that the world had finally taken notice. Audiences saw a cute, precocious teenager. What they didn't see was the boy who returned home to a cramped apartment where success still felt fragile, and the shadows of his childhood struggles lingered just beyond the spotlight. Even in those early years, Leonardo displayed an uncanny intensity. He wasn't satisfied with being the cute kid. He studied actors like Robert De Niro and Marlon Brando, mimicking their methods, dissecting their performances. He told his mother that he wanted to play roles that mattered, not just entertain, but transform. Yet with ambition came anxiety. He worried he wasn't good enough, that every opportunity might be his last. That gnawing fear, planted in the cracked sidewalks of his youth, would follow him for decades. Fame would magnify it, money would mask it, but it would never disappear. Because the truth was clear even then. Leonardo DiCaprio wasn't just chasing roles, he was chasing validation, chasing safety, chasing the chance to finally silence the ghosts of his childhood.
Leonardo DiCaprio was never destined for a quiet rise. His breakout didn't arrive on a silver platter. It came from clawing his way up through auditions that tested both his skill and his resilience.
By the early 1990s, he was no longer just the poor boy from East Hollywood. He was a young actor with fire in his eyes, ready to burn through the skepticism of casting directors and critics alike. The turning point came in 1993. DiCaprio landed a role in What's Eating Gilbert Grape, a small-town drama starring Johnny Depp. Cast as Arnie, a mentally challenged teenager, the 19-year-old threw himself into the part with startling authenticity. His performance was so raw, so convincing, that audiences wondered if the studio had hired a real disabled boy. For Leonardo, it was both a compliment and a weight. He was now shouldering the expectation of a prodigy. The Academy noticed. An Oscar nomination followed, placing him on a stage where few teenagers had stood before. Overnight, he went from the sitcom kid to the one to watch. But success at such an age carried invisible costs. The nomination meant he was no longer free to experiment without scrutiny. Every role, every choice was now a test of whether he truly belonged among Hollywood's elite. After Gilbert Grape, DiCaprio faced the cruel paradox of young fame. The opportunities expanded, but so did the pressure. He was cast in a string of diverse films: The Basketball Diaries, where he portrayed a drug-addicted high school student, and Romeo plus Juliet, Baz Luhrmann's frenetic reimagining of Shakespeare's tragedy. In each, DiCaprio pushed himself further, tearing away layers of his own identity to disappear into characters that demanded vulnerability. Behind the camera, however, he was unraveling. The work consumed him. Friends described him as obsessive, rehearsing until exhaustion, demanding retakes long after directors were satisfied. His fear of failure was relentless, rooted in the hunger of a child who once had nothing. And while his peers indulged in the youthful excess of Hollywood nightlife, Leonardo often oscillated between wild parties and solitary withdrawal. The imbalance foreshadowed the cracks to come. The defining explosion arrived in 1997 when James Cameron cast him opposite Kate Winslet in Titanic. At first, DiCaprio resisted. The role of Jack Dawson seemed too safe, too romantic, too pretty boy for someone determined to prove his depth. Cameron had to push hard, even threatening to replace him, before Leonardo relented.
What followed was nothing short of cultural detonation. Titanic became the highest-grossing film of all time, and Leonardo, at just 23, was transformed into the world's most recognizable heartthrob. His face adorned magazine covers, his name trended globally, and teenage fans camped outside his hotel rooms, desperate for a glimpse of Leo. But for the young actor, this wasn't triumph, it was suffocation. The fame he had once craved now arrived as a tidal wave, stripping away his anonymity and pigeonholing him as the pretty face. Critics dismissed him as a teen idol, overlooking the nuance of his performances. He was adored, yet dismissed, idolized, yet underestimated. DiCaprio responded with defiance. He turned down countless romantic roles, refusing to repeat Jack Dawson. Instead, he sought projects that terrified him. Gritty collaborations with Martin Scorsese, morally ambiguous characters, stories that revealed the darker corners of human nature. He wanted respect, not applause. And yet, the cracks remained. The Titanic phenomenon left him restless, wary of intimacy, and suspicious of those who approached him. Was it Leo the actor they loved, or Leo the myth? In interviews, he dodged questions about relationships, insisting he had no time for commitment. Rumors swirled about endless parties, about model girlfriends, about a young man drowning in excess. The irony was painful. The boy who once longed for validation now found it unbearable. The spotlight he had chased since childhood had finally arrived, but instead of fulfillment, it brought distortion. Every smile was dissected, every silence interpreted, every misstep magnified. By the time the new millennium dawned, Leonardo DiCaprio was not just a star, He was a cultural obsession. But beneath the glamour, he was already at war with the very machine that had built him. Because with fame came fractures, and with adoration came isolation. And as he moved from triumph to triumph, the question grew louder. How long could Leonardo DiCaprio run from the very image that made him?
By the early 2000s, Leonardo DiCaprio had become more than just an actor. He was a cultural phenomenon, the face of a generation who had grown up with Titanic posters on their walls. But he refused to remain frozen as the boyish Jack Dawson. Determined to shatter the teen idol label, DiCaprio entered a new phase of his career, one defined by risk, reinvention, and relentless ambition. The partnership that would shape this phase began in 2002, when Martin Scorsese cast him in Gangs of New York. It was a bold move. Scorsese, one of cinema's greatest craftsmen, was known for shaping legends like Robert De Niro. Now, he was handing the mantle to a young star many critics dismissed as a pretty face. DiCaprio knew he had to deliver. He trained tirelessly, studied dialects, immersed himself in the brutal history of New York's Five Points. And though the film received mixed reviews, it signaled a transformation. Leo was no longer chasing fame, he was chasing legacy. The partnership with Scorsese blossomed into one of Hollywood's most celebrated actor-director partnerships. The Aviator 2004 saw DiCaprio embody Howard Hughes, a role that demanded both brilliance and madness. His portrayal of the aviation tycoon's descent into obsessive-compulsive disorder was harrowing, intimate, and undeniably mature. Suddenly, the industry stopped sneering. He was nominated for another Academy Award, and the narrative shifted. DiCaprio wasn't just a star, he was an artist. But fame at that height was double-edged. Leonardo became a fixture in tabloids, his personal life dissected with brutal curiosity. Paparazzi stalked him relentlessly, capturing nights out at Hollywood clubs, snapshots on yachts, and his string of relationships with supermodels. To the media, these became his defining traits. He was branded the eternal bachelor, a man-child refusing to settle down. The gossip magazines built a caricature, but behind it was a man deeply conflicted, someone who, according to friends, craved intimacy but feared vulnerability. His fear wasn't baseless. Hollywood had a way of devouring its own. Leonardo saw contemporaries rise and fall, broken by addiction, scandal, or burnout. He guarded his privacy fiercely, often disappearing for months between films. He surrounded himself with a tight circle of childhood friends, the so-called pussy posse, who provided familiarity in an industry of shifting loyalties. To outsiders, it looked like indulgence. To Leonardo, it was survival. Meanwhile, the work only grew more demanding. In The Departed, 2006, another Scorsese triumph, he delivered one of the rawest performances of his career, playing an undercover cop unraveling under pressure. Critics hailed it as the role that finally erased the shadow of Titanic. Yet the process nearly broke him. He admitted to sleepless nights, anxiety attacks, and the emotional toll of living in a character's skin long after filming wrapped. He confessed, "Sometimes I don't know where the character ends and I begin."
And then came Inception, 2010, Christopher Nolan's dream-bending masterpiece. The film solidified DiCaprio not just as a critical darling, but also as a global box office force. His performance as Dom Cobb, a thief tormented by grief, resonated with audiences who saw in him a man both brilliant and broken. It mirrored, in many ways, Leonardo's own contradictions, an actor thriving at the height of success, yet carrying invisible burdens. By the 2010s, DiCaprio had achieved what many thought impossible. He was both the biggest star and one of the most respected actors in the world. He commanded salaries in the tens of millions, headlined billion-dollar films, and carried the weight of audience expectation with apparent ease. But behind the ease was exhaustion. Each role demanded deeper immersion, more emotional sacrifice, more pressure to prove he was worthy of the pedestal he'd been placed upon. And even as he conquered Hollywood, he began to confront another battlefield, the world itself. His environmental activism became a second identity. He spoke at the United Nations, funded conservation projects, and produced documentaries on climate change. Admirers praised his commitment. Skeptics mocked his contradictions. Could a man flying private jets truly preach about carbon footprints? The criticism stung, but DiCaprio pressed on, convinced that his fame could be leveraged for something greater than himself. Yet, in the quiet hours, away from cameras and accolades, the cracks widened. Friends whispered of his solitude. He cycled true relationships, none lasting beyond a few years. He admitted to moments of emptiness, when the applause faded and the silence felt heavier than any stage. He was adored by millions, but understood by few. At the height of his fame, Leonardo DiCaprio had everything the world promised: wealth, beauty, power, influence, and yet he often seemed like a man still searching, still unsettled, still carrying the restless hunger of the boy from East Hollywood.
For every dazzling red carpet appearance and blockbuster triumph, Leonardo DiCaprio faced a private storm that few ever glimpsed. By the late 2000s, the pressures of fame had begun to exact a toll, and whispers of a darker side trailed him wherever he went. Tabloids painted him as a hedonist: endless yacht parties in the Mediterranean, champagne-fueled nights in New York clubs, an ever-rotating cast of girlfriends, all half his age, all models. Leonardo DiCaprio, forever young, forever partying, wrote the Daily Mail in 2012. The narrative was irresistible: Hollywood's golden boy refusing to grow up. But behind the headlines, friends told a different story. The parties, they said, weren't joy, they were escape, a way to outrun the anxiety that fame had carved into him. The cracks in his armor began to surface in subtler ways. During press tours, he grew visibly weary of questions about his love life, often deflecting with rehearsed charm. On film sets, directors noted his intensity could spiral into obsession. Martin Scorsese later admitted that during Shutter Island 2010, DiCaprio struggled with the weight of the role, so immersed in his character's trauma that he carried it off set. He said it stayed with him. You could see the toll. There were also professional stumbles. For years, the Academy seemed to tease him, nominating him, praising him, but never awarding him. The running joke became public spectacle: Leonardo, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. Each loss was magnified by memes, each Oscars night a reminder that despite his brilliance, Hollywood still withheld its ultimate crown. It became this obsession in the media, DiCaprio admitted. It wasn't healthy. The pressure fed his perfectionism, and with it, an undercurrent of despair. Rumors of burnout swirled. Between 2002 and 2015, DiCaprio threw himself into some of the most demanding roles in cinema: Howard Hughes, Billy Costigan, Jordan Belfort, Hugh Glass. Each required extreme physical and emotional sacrifice. On The Revenant, he endured freezing temperatures, raw bison liver, and months of isolation in the wilderness. He won his long-awaited Oscar, yes, but at what cost? Crew members later revealed that DiCaprio often returned to his tent in tears, his body shaking from exhaustion.
The mask of invincibility slipped further in his personal life. His refusal to marry or start a family became fodder for speculation. Critics mocked him as Peter Pan in Prada, a man incapable of commitment. Privately, Leonardo confided to close friends that intimacy terrified him.
He had witnessed too much instability in his childhood, seen too many Hollywood marriages implode under pressure. Better to remain unattached, he reasoned, than to risk devastation. But solitude came with its own pain. Friends described him as restless, prone to bouts of melancholy. He'd be surrounded by people at a party, one insider recalled, but you could see it in his eyes. He was somewhere else entirely. Others noted his reliance on substances during particularly stressful shoots, though DiCaprio himself has never publicly admitted to addiction. Still, the whispers clung to him. The playboy who partied too hard, the star who needed escape just to keep going. The press was merciless. In 2015, The Guardian ran a profile calling him a paradox, the actor who wants to be taken seriously but lives like a stereotype. Memes about his girlfriends under 25 flooded the internet, turning his private choices into global punchlines. The laughter stung, because beneath the caricature was a man grappling with genuine loneliness. Even his activism, meant to give his life purpose, came under fire. Critics accused him of hypocrisy, citing his private jets and luxury yachts. Climate skeptics dismissed him as a celebrity playing savior. DiCaprio continued to speak at the UN to fund conservation, but the backlash gnawed at him. He was trying to matter beyond Hollywood, yet every effort seemed twisted against him. By the mid-2010s, Leonardo DiCaprio stood at a strange crossroads. Professionally, he was at his zenith, crowned with an Oscar and hailed as one of the greatest actors of his generation. Personally, he was trapped in a narrative he couldn't escape. The eternal bachelor, the environmental hypocrite, the star who had everything and yet somehow nothing. The downfall wasn't a single scandal or implosion. It was slower, more insidious. A steadier erosion of peace, of trust, of clarity. A man once defined by his hunger now seemed defined by his emptiness. Because the cruelest truth was this: the world adored Leonardo DiCaprio's image, but few cared to understand the man beneath it.
By the time Leonardo DiCaprio finally held the golden statue aloft at the 2016 Academy Awards, the world assumed he had reached the summit. Standing before Hollywood's elite, he gave a speech not about himself, but about climate change, a calculated reminder that he was more than a movie star. The ovation thundered, social media exploded, and the meme of "Leo never wins" finally died. To millions, this was his victory lap. To him, it was something more complex and far darker. Behind the applause was exhaustion bordering on collapse. The journey to the Revenant had drained him physically and mentally. He spoke later of the brutal shoot, plunging into freezing rivers, eating raw liver, enduring temperatures so low that cameras malfunctioned. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," he admitted. Yet the truth left unspoken was that the role demanded more than his body. It demanded his sanity. Friends recall him returning from filming withdrawn, haunted, and unable to sleep. The Oscar was a prize, yes, but also a symbol of just how much he had sacrificed. Privately, Leonardo began confronting something he had long feared: the creeping emptiness of success. He had the career, the fortune, the influence, but the silence after the applause was deafening. In interviews, he danced around questions of family, hinting at the ache beneath his carefully guarded persona. "Do I want to have children someday? Yes, but I just don't know if I'm ready." To many, it was a casual remark. To those close to him, it was the sound of a man who had built a world of achievements only to discover there was no one to share it with. The darker spiral emerged in his personal habits. The parties continued, the headlines multiplied. Leonardo DiCaprio, spotted with new model girlfriend, became a weekly rhythm. What fans laughed at as typical Leo was to friends a symptom of avoidance. Intimacy required vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one thing he could not risk. There were also moments of confrontation with mortality. In 2010, while skydiving, one of DiCaprio's parachutes failed to open. A backup saved his life at the last moment. Later, on a flight to Moscow, one of the engines exploded mid-air. The plane emergency landed, but the memory lingered. "I've had a lot of brushes with death," he confessed. Each incident forced him to consider the fragility of everything he had built. Each reminded him that fame was no shield against fate. Professionally, the stakes only escalated. He became known for disappearing into roles that consumed him. In The Wolf of Wall Street, his manic portrayal of Jordan Belfort was both electrifying and disturbing. On set, the excess bled into reality. Long nights, relentless energy, scenes that left him trembling. Colleagues praised his commitment, but some wondered aloud whether the performance had taken something from him he could never get back. And then there was the isolation. By the late 2010s, DiCaprio had withdrawn further from the public eye. He rarely gave interviews, avoided social media, and communicated mostly through carefully crafted appearances. Paparazzi still followed, capturing glimpses of him on yachts or at charity galas, but the man himself seemed increasingly absent, as if retreating from the world he had once fought so hard to conquer. For many, the tragedy of Leonardo DiCaprio is not found in scandal or collapse. It is found in the slow erosion of his spirit. The boy who once fought against poverty and rejection had achieved everything he dreamed of, but at the cost of a gnawing loneliness. The actor who could embody any character seemed unable to fully embody himself. And perhaps the cruelest moment of all, when the world finally crowned him with the recognition he had long deserved, he felt not triumph, but emptiness. The Oscar was meant to be a climax, but instead it underscored the futility of chasing validation. The applause faded, the headlines disappeared, and Leonardo was left with the same haunting question he had carried since childhood. Is this all there is? It was a question without an easy answer, and it cast a shadow over every success that followed.
For all the turbulence, Leonardo DiCaprio's story is not only one of downfall, it is also one of resilience, influence, and a search for meaning that extends beyond the bright lights of Hollywood. By the time he entered his late 40s, DiCaprio had become something larger than an actor. He had become a symbol of talent, of endurance, and of the strange paradox of fame itself. His filmography reads like a journey through human complexity, the fragile innocence of Arnie in What's Eating Gilbert Grape, the doomed dreamer Jack Dawson in Titanic, the obsessive brilliance of Howard Hughes, the tormented soul of Billy Costigan, the corrupt mania of Jordan Belfort, the wounded survivor Hugh Glass. Each role was a mirror, not only of society's contradictions, but of DiCaprio's own. Critics often remarked that his characters seemed to blur with his personal struggles, as though he chose roles that forced him to wrestle with the very demons that haunted him. Beyond the screen, his activism reshaped how celebrities engaged with global crises. The Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation poured millions into environmental conservation, funding projects from protecting tigers in Asia to preserving rainforests in the Amazon. His 2016 Oscar speech, focused not on his victory, but on climate change, was broadcast worldwide, inspiring countless young viewers to see the urgency of environmental action. Admirers hailed him as proof that stardom could be leveraged for good. And yet, his legacy is not without tension. To critics, the contradictions remain. The man who speaks of sustainability but vacations on yachts. The actor who plays with vulnerability but hides from true intimacy. These contradictions, however, may be exactly what makes him enduring. Leonardo DiCaprio is not a flawless icon. He is a portrait of imperfection. His very struggles, laid bare in public, reflect the fragility of chasing greatness in a world that demands more than any one person can give. Friends and collaborators often speak of a man who, beneath the guarded exterior, remains fiercely loyal, deeply curious, and eternally searching. Kate Winslet, his co-star and lifelong friend, once said, "Leo sees the world differently. He doesn't just act in movies, he absorbs life, and sometimes I think it hurts him more than he lets on." Perhaps this is why his story resonates so deeply. Because beneath the red carpets, beneath the headlines, is a boy who grew up on broken sidewalks in Los Angeles, who dreamed of more, who fought his way into the spotlight, and who discovered that the spotlight is as much curse as gift. In many ways, his life circles back to that childhood hunger, the desire to escape, to be seen, to prove his worth. The boy who once feared being forgotten has become unforgettable. Yet the man who reached the pinnacle still wonders if he has ever truly been known. And so, Leonardo DiCaprio's legacy is not simply the films, the awards, or the activism. It is the lesson he offers, that fame, no matter how bright, cannot heal the wounds of the past, that applause fades, but purpose endures, that the waves of the ocean, beautiful from afar, dangerous up close, can never be conquered, only navigated. It is this duality, brilliance and brokenness, triumph and tragedy, that ensures his story will be told long after the cameras fade.
Leonardo DiCaprio's journey is more than a biography. It is a mirror of the industry that shaped him. Hollywood thrives on consuming youth, sculpting myths, and discarding the human beneath the image. The media amplifies the laughter, the gossip, the spectacle, until even the brightest stars begin to believe the caricatures drawn of them. DiCaprio's life reminds us that behind every smile on the red carpet lies a person carrying burdens invisible to the crowd. His triumphs are undeniable, but so too are the costs. In the end, the question isn't whether he won enough awards or dated the right people. It is whether the pursuit of fame itself can ever truly satisfy the soul. Behind the glory, there is always the price.